Once I had the master cutting jigs made, I then took these and traced it onto a sheet of 4x8 or 4x12 of 025 and 032 aluminum. And I cut out all of the ribs that I needed to, rough cutting them with the pair of tin snips to approximate size, about a 1/4 inch over the size of the forams. I then cut my jig pin holes, and what I did for cutting my jig pin holes is I located the first one in the jig using a center punch, a transfer punch, which is a 1/4 inch, basically a piece of 1/4 inch dowel rod with a center punch on it. And I locate these and drilled these out, and then I cut the second pin by locating it with the center punch again and drilling the holes out. I then placed, on this one I'm cutting out some 032 material, but on the 024 I was able to cut out 4 to 5 at one time on the router. I have a fairly high powered 1/2 inch router, and I was using a 1/2 inch solid carbide flush cutting bit, a spiral flush cutting bit with a double pilot bearing on the top. If you were using a 1/4 inch bit, you'd have to use probably cut out a few less pieces at a time, but I found cutting 4 pieces worked pretty well. I set the router on a fairly high RPM. I think it was around 15 to 18,000 RPM is what tended to work best for me on this router. I then, running through the jig pin holes, I ran a 1/4 inch bolt, and using a wing nut, tightened down and clamped it down to the piece of aluminum. For my case, I'm using a simple, cheap homemade router table I did out of a piece of 1/2 inch maple. It could be a piece of plywood. I happen to have this was the inside of a door, and just mounted it to an old cabinet. I had another router table that I was using, but I had a little bit of run out on it. It was causing chattering of the bit, and I couldn't adjust the speed. So this one worked a lot better for me. One thing to be very careful with is this throws off lots of chips. They often are hot. So make sure you're wearing full eye protection. That's probably the most important thing you do. Also, when you're feeding the piece into the bit, what I tend to do is cut very close on one edge so that there is very little material to bite through. Take a firm hold of the material and bring it into the material very slowly, or it might grab a lot and start pulling it. Router can be very dangerous, so be very careful in how you use the router. But start off very slowly, move it into it very controlled, and never let go of the piece you're cutting with. If it was happened to pull back into a piece of material, this piece could go flying and you just throw it away. It could hurt you. It could also damage the piece you're working on. Also make sure that however you're pushing this, you want to make sure that you always push it so your hands are not in the way. You want to make sure you're always removing your hands so you don't have to be looking at your hands to make sure you don't run them into the router bit. Also, you want to make sure as you feed this into the rotation of the router bit. So in this case, the router bit is turning counterclockwise, and so I want to make sure I feed it like this into the router bit. If you're feeding it the opposite direction, it's going to pull away, it's going to grab, and it's going to kick the material around and give a bad cut, break your router bit, or hurt yourself. So here we'll cut this one. I've already cut this one out partially with the router, and we'll go ahead and finish it cutting it, and I'll also show how I do the lightning holes. Cutting the lightning holes out, I like to have the router stop where I start up because I don't want to accidentally get into the piece and have it grab heavily. I also like to do it in such a way that I can have the router bit have the template between me and the router bit. That way it will throw the chips this way. The chips get very hot, and with short sleeves on here, it tends to burn a bit. So clean off the table. Start off with the first piece here. Hopefully we have enough clearance around everything. Start up the router. Wait for the router to stop. Clean off the table. Take a pair of tin snips and cut out the circle. I stopped about 1/8 inch from the edge of the circle so these things don't drop down and start flying around as projectiles inside. You always want to save a little bit and just cut them off with a pair of tin snips and it takes care of that. I now cut the other pieces, making sure it's centered in the hole now so it doesn't grab when it starts. For this specific set of ribs that I have, two of the 032 thickness ones, they call out for a smaller lightning hole in the rear, so it allows me to also put through the flap tube through here. So for this one, I don't cut out, I didn't use the master cutting jig to cut out this hole. I used it for all the 025 ribs, but for the 032 ribs, I used a smaller hole. I did notice that on the kit forms, they use the smaller hole for all of them. Using the larger hole will save a little bit lighter weight on the 032, 025 ribs. It could be done either way. But on this one, I simply used the piece that I used for my original false ribs and also use it for the remaining 6 or 8 032 ribs. So we'll place this here, start the router. Stop, remove all my aluminum filings. Again, cut out the center. What I did in the master form block and what I also will do here, after I cut it out, I need to go back and trim off this little nib that's left. And also go around one more time and make sure you clean everything out to do a final cut. I do a final cut around the edge and around this to make sure I get all the last pieces out. So now from this, I now have two more, and my final two center ribs. They're perfect length, and these have been cut out so they're 1/8 inch shorter than the full length ribs, and some of the others I have are 1/4 inch shorter, and some of them are full length.